What was Steve really asking? What he really wanted to know was, in the face of the suffering of kids in Africa, and in the face of his own suffering, is God good? That's what he really wanted to know. And if he's good, how can I trust him? So Steve Jobs had a gap in his understanding that really troubled him, and for good reason. Like, his doubts and his questions, they were driven by an authentic, God-given compassion. He held the two things in his mind: God's omniscience, him knowing everything, and the reality of suffering. For him, he didn't know how those two things could possibly fit together, but he wanted to see if there was an answer, if God could still be trusted. Usually the nature of our doubts involve something very, very real in our life. And often doubt comes down to two things. It comes down to two things in our minds that are at odds with each other, that need to be resolved. That's what doubt actually means. So doubt comes from the word duo, and it could be understood as of two minds. Doubt is something that we all deal with from time to time. Sometimes it's simple, harmless questions that really don't have that much significance in our lives. Sometimes they're about insignificant issues. Other times, there are world-bending, heart-clenching, crippling questions that make it hard to actually see anything else. So how do we deal with doubt? Our main text this morning is very simple and very short. Be merciful to those who doubt. And because it's something that we all deal with, and we have dealt with since the beginning of humanity, we see it expressed in the Bible. In fact, many of the doubts that we have today, or those big questions, they're very much so present and very potent in the Bible. So, if you doubt, my first point, you are in good company. We have not only the history of humanity that asks these big questions, but we also have authors in the Bible. So in the Bible, we've got example of like the Apostle Thomas. We've got the Psalms, Habakkuk, Job, Lamentations. So for example, Job was racked by doubt, and he was doubting God's justice, his goodness, and his love. Yet God still held him up as righteous. God didn't hold his doubts against him. In the Psalms, we have tons of examples of the psalmist voicing doubts and fears and questions. For example, we've got Psalm 22 and 23 back to back. So in Psalm 22, Jesus quoted this on the cross. We've got the problem of God's hiddenness. It says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish. My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. And then immediately following that, we see Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. We see the pendulum take this massive swing from, my God, why have you forsaken me? Are you even there anymore? To, God is always with me. He is comforting me at all times. And in Habakkuk, we see the problem of evil. The prophet cries out, why do you tolerate wrongdoing? And then later, why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? And we've got the Apostle Thomas, sometimes called Doubting Thomas, and I think that's an unfair name, by the way. When Jesus rose from the dead, he was one of the last to see him. And he said, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hands into his side, I will not believe. One of my favorite authors right now, Philip Yancey, I'm going to quote him all over the place, so just be ready for that. He says, when I speak to college students, I challenge them to find a single argument against God in the older agnostics like Bertrand Russell, Voltaire, David Hume, or the newer ones like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, or Sam Harris, that is not already included in Psalms, Job, Habakkuk, and Lamentation. I have respect for a God, he continues, who not only gives us the freedom to reject him, but also includes the arguments we can use in the Bible. God seems rather doubt tolerant, actually. God's not afraid of our doubts. We have to hear that this morning. It's a very, very human experience. And nearly every human that's ever lived has experienced doubts in some way or another at some times. And sometimes there are even crippling doubts that make us wonder, how the heck did we ever believe this in the first place? That is a sign of a mind that is ready for the deeper things of God. So when handled well, doubt is actually a propellant to faith. My next point, not a repellent. Is it there? It's frozen? Oh. Okay, skip to it if you can find it. When handled well, doubt is a propellant to faith, not a repellent. So let's go back to that example of Thomas. So it was Thomas's doubts and his boldness to say what everyone thought, but everyone was too afraid to say, that initiated significant revelation. So we've got in John 14, Jesus is talking about how he's going to his Father's house to prepare a place for them, and that they do know where he's going and how to get there. And Thomas is like, no, we don't. He says, Lord, we don't know where we're going, where you're going. So how can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. So perhaps Jesus would have said this kind of a thing anyway, but the Gospels give us this gem of a response, that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, in response to Thomas's questioning and his doubts. So instead of chastising him, back up. Also, after Jesus was resurrected, as I said, Thomas didn't believe right away. He was like, unless I have hard evidence, I'm not going to believe. And instead of chastising him, Jesus gives him exactly what he's asking for. He said, and what he provided. Let me back up, getting tongue-tied here. Jesus said, put your fingers in my wounds. Go ahead. And then he falls down and says, my Lord and my God. One of the first times those two things are put together, my Lord and my God, and for Jesus. Thomas gave one of the first great confessions of the faith, outside of Peter. So, outside of that, this also provided evidence that later Gnostics had to come to terms with. So Gnostics were heretics that believed that Jesus was never physical, just a spiritual projection. This was driven by a false belief that everything physical was evil and only the spiritual was good. So that belief completely undermines the gospel. It completely undermines the doctrine of salvation, of creation and prophecies and so on. It was because of Thomas's questioning that we have this evidence that combats destructive heresies like that. Not to mention, we have other criticisms that are very much alive today about whether or not Jesus was actually raised from the dead. This is good evidence for the resurrection of Christ, and that was propelled by Thomas's authentic questioning. He says, go ahead, stick your hands in my wounds, which is kind of gross, but it provided us with something amazing. Doubts come when difficult questions arise that we don't have confident answers for. Back up. For Steve Jobs, his question ultimately came down to, is God good? And if he's good and all-knowing, how can he allow suffering? So what if Steve Jobs' question was taken seriously at the time? What if the pastor had said, that's a great question. How about you, me, and your dad go out to coffee and we'll chat this out. We'll talk about this. And instead didn't give him a one-sentence response, but actually started a conversation that took his doubts and used them to unearth deep, complex beauty of God. What if Steve Jobs didn't walk away from the faith and instead used his genius and not only to provide cutting-edge technology, but also to bring relief and the gospel to the world? That blows my mind to think about. Things would be massively different. So, and another point, the object of our faith determines the strength. Sometimes seasons of doubt help us to realize that the object of our faith was not Christ, but something else. And sometimes the object of our faith is our confidence in the answers that we have. But when we start to lose that confidence, because those answers are no longer doing it for us, the questions help us peel back the layers of our prior beliefs and really examine them, and to pursue truth and faith, to see the face of Jesus Christ more clearly. And as a result, when we come out of our seasons of doubt, our faith is simpler, yet much stronger, and it's much deeper and richer than before. So in our life, there usually comes a point when you realize that the system of belief that you've had in some way or another simply just doesn't fit. A misunderstanding on your part, or wrong teaching, whatever, that just simply doesn't match up with the way the world works, the way the Bible is. And maybe you need to tweak something about your belief system. Maybe you need to evaluate, okay, so maybe that's all it takes. Maybe just a little tweak, and you're good. Sometimes maybe it comes down to, okay, I really need to evaluate what I believe and why. Like, why do I believe in God? Why do I believe in Jesus? Why do I believe in the Bible? That's a healthy place to go and ask questions about it. So a common term for this whole thing is deconstruction, which is simply critically examining what we've always believed. There's a lot more to it than that, but this is the simplest way to say it. Theologian Greg Boyd says that he's gone through at least 5 of those, 5 significant seasons of deconstruction. And each time he ends up coming away with a smaller set of things that he really believes, but the things that he believes seem more solid to him. So he walks away caring less about certain things that are ultimately significant, and he cares a lot more about the things that truly matter. Okay, what do I mean? So the non-essentials, through our times of doubts and deconstruction, this is how it often goes. The non-essentials, like the age of the earth and the predestination, worship styles, and so on and so forth, those become less important. I don't mean non-important, still significant things to talk about, but they pale in comparison to the significance of bigger questions, like the existence of God, the deity of Jesus Christ, the authority of the Bible. All those things, if done well, become strengthened. How many of you have ever panned for gold? Is that a thing? 1, 2, 3, 4? Nice. That's more than I expected. I've never panned for gold, so I had to Google it, and I found out the method is pretty simple. You just get a pan full of rocks and water from a certain kind of place, rocks and dirt, and you fill it up with water, and you shake it so that the gold sinks down to the bottom, and then you tilt it to the side and swish the water back and forth. And it's like waves on a seashore pulling back the layers of sand and dirt. The idea, so it's shaking and it's swishing, and the idea is that process is uncovering the gold so you can finally see it at the bottom. Think of doubt like panning for gold. When we shake the pan of faith, letting the half-baked or just plain bad ideas wash away through critical thinking and truth-seeking, when done well, what's left is something more true and more robust than before. All right, I'm going to quote Philip Yancey again, or reference him really. If you know anything about Philip Yancey, he grew up in southern Alabama, in the South, in Alabama, during the 60s. Those were very formative times for him. He had grown up in a church that taught racism, and he blindly swallowed the doctrine of racism. As he grew up in the turbulent times of the civil rights movement, during which things were shaken and swooshed, but not just for Nancy, but for the entire U.S. Yancey. The events of the 60s, and especially like the brave and nonviolent protests led by Martin Luther King Jr., they challenged Yancey's racism, and it taught him and it caused him to doubt the very evil system that he'd grown up with. So over several years, through this process, God was finally washing away the dehumanizing false doctrines to uncover the truth, that all people are made equal in the image of God. So how do we doubt well? How do we make sure that in our times of doubts and struggling with these things, how do we make sure that we come out having a panning for gold experience and not something else? So I first want to confess that I've never gone through like an earth-shaking, life-shattering season of doubt. Most of these insights come from friends of mine that have gone through these, or other insights that I've gained along the way. Unfortunately, when many people experience doubt, it's not like panning for gold. Instead of patiently waiting for the gold to be uncovered, they give it all up and throw it all away, assuming that there's nothing more than just useless dirt. And then they go out elsewhere looking for the truth. So I don't claim to know all the answers, and what I'm about to tell you is not all-inclusive or exhaustive, but here are a few thoughts. First, to doubt well, be humble. Remember who it is that we're doubting, which seems kind of weird to say. Remember who it is we're talking about. We're talking about the God that made the universe, the God that created reality, the God that has a perspective on reality that we simply don't. He has an understanding that we could never dream of. And there's no possible way that we can know everything that God knows. So we have to understand that God is so much higher than we are. And as we're dealing with these things, take that into account. So doubt helps us realize, actually, that we don't know everything. So as I talked about earlier, this can be a humbling time. So we also realize, though, that the Bible's not quite as clear as we wish it was, and that's a healthy thing to understand. There are things that we want to know that God simply hasn't revealed to us yet, because all that we can know about God, God has to first reveal. And then we've got to come to terms with that, but learn to trust God anyway. In times of doubt, allow that kind of transformation of the heart to happen. Okay, in light of that, second thing, to understand or seek to understand things from God's point of view, not our own. If God's the maker of reality, then we have a lesser, distorted view of reality and a limited view, then nothing's going to make sense unless we try to look at things from God's perspective. So you got to ask yourself, what does God care about? What is he up to in the world? What is his goal? And we get those things, we can only know those things through the Bible. And if God wanted, or if we got what we wanted, like for God to reveal himself, like writing his name, I exist in the stars, or to appear super visibly, or to erase all doubt of existence, his existence, or to step in every time evil were to happen and stop it, would that foster, would that accomplish what God's up to? Or would that keep him from accomplishing his goals in the world? So this is really a heart posture. God, it's your way, not mine, as much as it is an approach to the questions. Things aren't going to make sense unless we come from that angle. Okay, understand that your bag of questions, so to speak, will never be empty. We have to learn to live with this reality. Things are always going to be in our minds that we're wondering about. That's a good thing. We'll take out these questions one by one and answer them as they come, but usually they're replaced with a ton of other questions. So we got to be willing to say, nope, backing up. Yes, in light of that, be willing to live in the tension of uncertainty and faithfulness to Christ. We've got to be willing to say, I don't know about all these things, but what I do know is Jesus. And I want to live for him in obedience. So I'm going to cling to that. Even though I don't have this other stuff figured out, I'm clinging to Jesus. Be willing to live in that tension. Another thing that's really helpful is apologetics. Study apologetics. This is a tool that God's given us. Apologetic is simply a defense. You can have an apologetic for why you think the best football team is the Lakers or something. So a Christian apologetic, some of you got that joke, that's good. Christian apologetic is a branch of theology that is aimed at giving a reasoned, thoughtful response to the tough questions in life. There is an enormous wealth of apologetic research online, and tons of books and lots of podcasts. A good place to start for that one is a book called On Guard by William Lane Craig. I wish I had a picture of it. That's a good place to start. It's where I got my start in apologetics. It's good for those who are relatively unfamiliar with some of the most classic arguments for the existence of God, the reliability of Scripture, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There is stuff out there that honors the intellectual side. Apologetics has kind of gotten a bad rap from a lot of folks, but I believe that it really is a powerful, helpful place, a helpful tool in our tool belt as we wrestle with life's deepest questions. It's not going to be a cure-all. It's merely one tool in the belt for thoughtful faith. Okay, and don't suppress your doubts. Honor them. Philip Yancey says, there he is again, by saying don't doubt, just believe in response to people's doubts, you really don't resolve the doubts. They tend to resurface in a more toxic form. They come back with a lot more force, often destructive force, if left unresolved for too long. And also be willing to doubt your doubts. In other words, be willing to examine yourself to see if your questions are actually answerable or fair. So sometimes, or maybe they're driven by something that is not really intellectual, but something else that's masquerading as doubts, as questions, like anger towards God, or an idol in our life that we just simply refuse to give up, or wanting to be God, not wanting Him over us. Sometimes it's about an illicit relationship or sinful habit that we know God will demand that we give up, but instead of willing submission, we express our struggle with that by asking, does this God really exist? And if He does He really care about my issue? Does He care about my sin? In that case, it's really an effort to keep worshiping an idol that we know will otherwise have to be handed over and taken down. Okay, our goal through doubt, next one, is not certainty necessarily, but a person. That is Jesus. Where there is certainty, there is no room for faith. Your life comes from Christ and not from the certainty of your beliefs. And lastly, find a doubt companion. Someone that can patiently and honestly walk with you through this. So it's my hope that our church is full of potential doubt companions, to be a safe place where we can express and deconstruct and ask questions together and have our doubts so we can honor them and allow deeper faith to take place. And last, as I bring this in for a landing, when someone walks away from the faith in response to their doubts, sometimes it really means that they're in process, and what they're leaving is not Jesus, but a particular framework. So, and then the best question that they have, or the best way to express that is, I'm just not a Christian anymore, though sometimes that is the case. So, for example, Marty Sampson, have you heard about Marty Sampson? He is a writer for Hillsong, and he and Joshua Harris, who was a pioneer of the Puritan movement, they both came out on Instagram, which is apparently the hot place to come out as agnostic or whatever. They both announced that they're leaving the faith on Instagram. I don't have time to deal with Joshua Harris, but Marty Sampson said, I think I have a slide with this. Time for some real talk. I'm genuinely losing my faith, and it doesn't bother me. He goes on to say, how many preachers fall? Many. No one talks about it. How many miracles happen? Not many. No one talks about it. Why is the Bible full of contradiction? No one talks about it. How can God love yet send 4 billion people to a place all because they don't believe? No one talks about it. And later, Samson clarified that he wasn't actually losing his faith altogether. He's just on really shaky ground, is how he said it. So I'm actually not convinced that Joshua Harris or Marty Sampson were completely walking away from Jesus. I think My hypothesis is that they were actually both confronted with something in their framework that simply didn't work. They weren't biblical or true to how God works. And for example, Marty Sampson said over and over, no one talks about it. Like, why is the Bible full of contradictions and stuff? Nobody talks about it. They have been talking about it for a few thousand years. That's the truth. But maybe in his circle, maybe it was so emotion-based that asking these kinds of questions just wasn't happening. And so what he was leaving was actually this framework. I'm not feeling it right now. I have these questions, so I guess that means I'm not a Christian if I don't feel it right now. So now he's walking away from this framework rooted in emotional experience, not something deeper and robust. So we should pray for him and those like him that this is part of God's process of calling him into something deeper and much stronger. And there's a good friend of mine who actually identifies with this. He grew up in a hyper-fundamentalist and very rigid faith. There were several things growing up that he'd been taught, that if you believe this, then you're not a Christian, or if you don't believe this, then you're not a Christian. And he's told me some of those things. They are not that foundational. So when he went to college, he started questioning and asking these kinds of questions and thinking, well, maybe the earth wasn't created in 6 days, and all the kinds of questions too that he's just kind of stopped believing in or changed his thoughts. And now because of his framework that he'd grown up with, he's no longer defined as a Christian. So the best language he had for that is, I'm no longer a Christian. So it's because the foundation of his faith was so rigid and certain with little to no room for questioning, his faith actually proved to be very fragile and not resilient. So, don't we want Marty and my friend to come back to the faith? Absolutely, yes we do. But do we want them to come back to the exact same thing as before? No, we don't. Because it failed to stand up to heat. What we want for them is to come back to something truer than before, closer to the heart of Christ, closer to the Bible, and able to stand up to rigorous questioning. And when someone we know starts to experience doubt, the last thing we should do is freak out. First of all, as we talked about, doubt can be a very good thing. And second of all, it is our job to journey with them, to help find the answers together, to go deeper into more thoughtful, robust Christianity and point them to Jesus. Though we should try, it is ultimately not our job to convince others. That's the job of the Holy Spirit. Our job is to be faithful and leave the results to God. Let God do things in his own timing. And ultimately, to obey the words of Jude 22, be merciful to those who doubt. Pray with me. God, you have ordered such a magnificent universe, magnificent world, that you say in Romans that those who reject you are without excuse because of all the proofs that you've given just in creation. But at the same time, God, you honor the fact that people think hard about things. You honor the fact that we have the freedom to ask these questions. We have the freedom to choose to love you. And I pray that for those in the room today that are experiencing heavy doubts that make them question whether or not you're real or whether or not you care, anything, God, I pray that your peace and your presence is very evident in their life and that you work with them and bring someone in their life to work with them through these doubts in a way that ultimately uncovers the gold of the truth. And I pray for us as a church that we can be a place where that kind of a thing is happening. We love you, and we ultimately want to worship you and glorify you and point others to you and live for you and what you're about in the world. And I pray these things in your name. Amen. Okay. Because I had the authority to, I'm not doing a closing song. So grace and peace, you guys are dismissed.